The summer that year came in like a debt collector, early, aggressive, and completely indifferent to whether you were ready for it. By the second week of July, the pastures outside Harlan County had gone the color of old straw, the creek beds had cracked into dry puzzle pieces, and the air sat so heavy and motionless over the valley that breathing felt like a small, personal act of labor. It was the kind of heat that made men short-tempered and animals skittish, the kind that settled into the walls of old buildings and radiated back out long after the sun had gone down, as if the earth itself was trying to give back everything it had been holding all day. Frank Calder drove into town that Friday evening in a truck that had no business still running. It was a 1997 GMC with a cracked dashboard, a passenger window that only rolled down 3/4 of the way, and an exhaust system that announced his arrival to anyone within a quarter mile. The engine burned a quart of oil every 3 weeks, and the heater worked in July and refused to work in January, which Frank had long since decided was simply the truck's personality. He drove it because it started every morning and because he had stopped caring about appearances somewhere around his 43rd birthday, which was also the year he came home from a deployment that lasted 11 months and had no official name. He had a problem. The well pump on the eastern edge of his property had seized that afternoon without warning, the way mechanical things always failed, not gradually, not with polite warning signs, but all at once and at the worst possible moment. The cattle needed water. The replacement pump cost $480. Frank's checking account held $61, a number he knew precisely because he had checked it that morning while drinking black coffee on his porch, watching the sun come up over the ridge the way he had watched it come up over worse horizons in worse places, and finding, despite everything, that he still preferred this one. He had heard about the open challenge from Beto Reyes, a ranch hand who worked the neighboring property and occasionally helped Frank with fence repairs in exchange for the use of his flatbed trailer. $500, Beto had said, leaning against the fence post with his hat pushed back, grinning like a man sharing good gossip. Some fighter over at the Iron Creek was offering $500 cash to anyone who could last 3 minutes. Frank had nodded and said nothing, and driven home and eaten a bowl of leftover rice and beans, and sat on his porch for a long time looking at the darkening sky. Then he got back in the truck. The Iron Creek Saloon was not the kind of establishment that appeared in travel guides. It occupied a long, low building at the edge of the county road, its parking lot a mixture of gravel and packed dirt, its sign missing 2 letters and nobody in a hurry to replace them. On ordinary nights, it smelled of draft beer and cigarettes, and the particular sadness of men who had nowhere better to be. On Friday nights, it smelled of all those things plus money and adrenaline, because on Friday nights the back room was cleared of its furniture, and a square of athletic tape went down on the concrete floor, and Russell Hendry, who managed the bar and had the permanently sunburned neck of a man who had spent too many years outdoors, collected buy-ins from the crowd and paid out to whoever walked away standing. Frank had been here once before, 3 years ago, to pick up a generator he'd bought off a man named Tuck who used the bar as a personal classified ad. He remembered the back room. He remembered the light bulb on its cord, and the concrete floor, and the way sound bounced off the low ceiling in a way that made everything louder than it needed to be. He ordered water at the bar. The bartender, a young woman with elaborate tattoos covering both forearms, gave him a look that was not quite pity and not quite amusement, and set the glass in front of him without comment. Frank drank it slowly, standing at the end of the bar, his back to the wall, watching the room with the unhurried attention of a man who had spent a significant portion of his life watching rooms. He was 54 years old. He stood 5'11" and had once stood it more upright, but years of ranch work had layered a slight forward hunch into his posture, a permanent lean that made him look like a man always about to pick something up. He was broad through the chest and shoulders in the way that comes not from a gym, but from 2 decades of physical work that never stops, lifting, hauling, digging, climbing, carrying. His hands were large and heavily scarred, the knuckles thickened, the skin at the creases permanently dark with the kind of ingrained grime that honest labor leaves behind. His face was deeply lined, sun-weathered to a dull bronze, with pale gray eyes that had the particular quality of looking at you and also somehow past you at the same time. He had served 22 years as a United States Navy SEAL. He had deployed 11 times across 3 different decades and 4 different continents. He had served as a team commander for the final 9 years of his career, running operations in environments whose names appeared in no public record and whose outcomes were discussed in rooms he no longer had clearance to enter. He had planned and executed raids in zero visibility, in freezing water, in the compressed and terrible silence of compounds where one wrong sound meant catastrophe. He had made decisions under conditions that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had not been there, and he had lived with the consequences of those decisions in the long, quiet way that men like him learn to carry things, not by setting them down, but by getting so accustomed to the weight that it eventually stops feeling like weight at all. He had come home to the ranch because the ranch was honest. It demanded exactly what it demanded and gave back exactly what it gave, without politics, without ambiguity, without the layered moral complexity of the work he had left behind. He did not talk about his service. He had no bumper stickers, no hats, no framed photographs on the walls of his house. His neighbor Eleanor Marsh, a retired teacher who brought him soup when he was ill and borrowed his tractor in spring, had lived 3 miles from him for 7 years and believed he had spent his career doing contract logistics work for the federal government, which was technically not entirely false. He heard Dale Crew before he saw him. The noise of the back room was general and loud, but Dale's voice cut through it, sharp, performative, shaped for an audience. Frank finished his water, set the glass down, and walked toward the sound. The back room held perhaps 30 men arranged in a rough ring around the taped square on the floor. The bare bulb above swung on its cord in the draft from a box fan mounted in the corner window, throwing slow shadows across the walls. The energy in the room was the specific energy of men who had gathered to watch something happen to someone else, which is one of the oldest and least flattering human impulses, and which Frank had seen expressed in a great many different cultural contexts over the years. Dale Crew stood in the center of the square. He was 26 years old, compact and heavily muscled, his torso a geometry of training and protein and disciplined repetition. His hands were wrapped in red tape. He wore compression shorts and nothing else, and he moved with the fluid, self-aware ease of a man who had learned to inhabit his own body as a kind of instrument, and who took considerable pleasure in the fact. He had 14 amateur fights. He had won 11 of them, 7 by stoppage. He had a gym 2 towns over with his name above the door, and a social media following that he checked more often than he would admit. He was talented. He was disciplined. He was also, in the precise and specific way that certain kinds of early success produces, completely convinced that he had already seen everything the world had to offer him by way of genuine challenge. He stopped moving when Frank walked in. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he has already categorized, a single sweep of the eyes, top to bottom, dismissive in its speed. He saw the frayed canvas shirt, the heavy work boots, the gray and the stubble on the older man's jaw, the slight forward stoop. He saw what he expected to see, which is always the most dangerous thing a fighter can do. "You lost, old-timer," Dale said. The room laughed on cue, the way rooms do when a confident man makes a joke at the expense of someone who doesn't seem to notice. Frank didn't answer right away. He looked at the taped square. He looked at the swinging light bulb. He looked at Dale's feet, which were clean and uncalloused, and told him everything he needed to know about the conditions under which this young man had learned to fight, padded and lit and refereed and safe, with a corner and a cutman, and the reliable presence of rules designed to ensure that nobody actually died. "Heard there was 500, Frank said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had given orders in situations where a raised voice would have gotten people killed. Dale grinned and turned to the crowd with his hands spread, performing for them. "You hear this guy," he said. The crowd responded. A few men laughed. One of them, a broad mechanic named Harlow who had done 2 tours in Iraq and had a particular sensitivity to certain qualities in certain men, put his beard down quietly and watched. "You ever even been in a fight, old man?" Dale asked, turning back. Frank was removing his boots. He did it without drama or theater, standing on one foot and then the other, pulling them off with the economical motion of a man who had dressed and undressed in darkness, in cold water, in conditions that made this concrete room feel like a luxury hotel. He set the boots against the wall neatly, heels together. He peeled off his socks. His bare feet on the concrete were pale and dense with callus, the skin of his heels ridged and thick from years of hard ground. "Ring the bell," Frank said. Something moved across Dale's face so quickly that only a few people in the room caught it. Not fear, not yet. Something more like the brief flicker of a man who has said something to a dog and had the dog fail to react, and who is processing what that means. He filed it away. He bounced once on his toes, rolled his neck, and nodded to Russell at the edge of the room. Russell slapped his hand against the wall. Dale came forward fast, because fast was his native language, and he saw no reason to change dialects for a man who looked like this. He threw a double jab to establish his range, crisp and snapping, and then loaded a straight right cross aimed at the junction of Frank's jaw, a precise and well-practiced punch that had ended 4 of his 11 wins, and that he threw with the confidence of a man deploying a tool he trusted completely. Frank did not slip it with elegance. He did not dance backward or demonstrate any of the technical footwork that Dale had spent years refining. He dropped his chin by 1/2 inch and rolled his lead shoulder inward, and Dale's knuckles struck the dense orbital ridge above his eye rather than the soft hinge of the jaw, and the difference was the difference between hitting a door and hitting the frame. Dale felt the impact travel wrong up through his wrist and into his elbow. He had aimed for glass and found stone. Frank took it, blinked, and stood exactly where he had been. Dale threw a right body kick, his shin driving hard into Frank's left side, a Muay Thai strike with genuine power and good mechanics behind it. It landed. The sound it made caused 3 men in the front row to wince. Frank absorbed it with a slow exhale through his nose, a slight tightening around his eyes, and no other visible reaction. He did not step back. He did not reach for the point of impact. He stood there and breathed and watched Dale with those flat, pale, unhurried eyes. And Dale, for the first time in as long as he could remember, felt the specific and deeply unpleasant sensation of not knowing what he was looking at. He threw a jab-teep combination, fast, designed to disrupt the older man's rhythm. Frank slipped the jab by turning his head a single small degree, not a full slip, not a coached movement, just the minimal adjustment of a man who had spent years operating in environments where excess motion was a liability. He caught the teep on his forearm and redirected it outward, not with force but with angle, and Dale's kick went wide and pulled his weight forward, and for 1/2 second his base was open and compromised. Frank put his hand flat on Dale's chest and pushed, not a strike, not a throw, a push applied with the steady, unhurried certainty of a man who had once held a flood door shut for 4 minutes while his team got clear. Dale stumbled back 3 full steps and caught himself just inside the tape line. The room had gone very quiet. The box fan hummed. The lights swung. Dale looked at Frank. Frank was looking at his own hands. Then he looked up, and when his eyes met Dale's, the younger man experienced something he had no prior vocabulary for: not aggression, not anger, not the competitive fire he was accustomed to seeing in opponents. Nothing. A total, weathered, absolute absence of anything that could be provoked or exploited. The eyes of a man for whom this moment was not dramatic. For whom this was simply a problem, like a seized well pump or a broken fence line. A thing that needed handling so he could go home. Dale came in hard. He abandoned patience, abandoned the technical discipline that his coaches had spent years drilling into him, and came in hard the way men do when something they cannot name has frightened them. He threw a looping overhand, then shot for the legs, driving his shoulder into Frank's hips, trying to take him to the ground where his training gave him certainty. Frank did not sprawl. He did not throw a knee. He stepped slightly offline, the diagonal of a single boot, barely 4 inches of movement, and the geometry of the entire exchange changed completely. Dale was suddenly driving through empty space, his head down, his momentum carrying him past where the target had been. Frank placed his left hand on the back of Dale's neck, his right hand gripping the waistband of the compression shorts at the hip, and simply continued what Dale's own body had already started. Dale hit the concrete beneath the foam pad. The impact was enormous. The sound it made was the sound of a large object falling from a height, and the crowd moved backward collectively, a single reflexive step, as if the floor itself had shuddered. Frank stepped back. His breathing had deepened but had not accelerated. He pressed his forearm lightly against his left side where the body kick had landed. He looked at Dale on the floor. "Minute and 40 left," he said quietly. Dale got up. He had to, because the alternative was something he had never practiced accepting. He got up with blood running freely from his nose, tracking down over his lip and dripping from his chin onto his chest, and he got up with his hands shaking in a way that was not technique and not adrenaline, but the particular tremor of a young man who has just had his entire understanding of himself rearranged without warning. He got up because he was brave, which was real, and because he was proud, which right now was getting him hurt. He came forward again. He was more careful now, the performance gone, the crowd gone, the social media highlight reel gone. Just 2 men in a concrete room under a swinging light. He threw a laid hook with good mechanics, committed weight, proper hip rotation. Frank caught it on his forearm and answered with a short, compact elbow to the side of Dale's jaw that had no elegance to it whatsoever. It was a gross motor movement, ugly and ancient and effective, the kind of thing that is not taught in gyms because it has no sport application and every practical one. Dale's legs went soft. He grabbed instinctively and Frank let him. He let Dale's arms wrap around him, and he held him for a moment the way a patient man holds something that is thrashing, with no anger and no cruelty and no hurry. He could feel the younger man's heart hammering against his chest, the desperate working of his lungs, the involuntary shuddering in his limbs. Frank walked Dale to the ground. He did not slam him. He lowered him, controlled, kneeling beside him on the concrete, his forearm sliding under Dale's jaw in the slow and inevitable way of a man completing a task. He applied pressure the way a hydraulic press applies pressure, not with violence but with the terrifying and inarguable physics of geometry and leverage and patience. Dale tapped before it finished. His hand hit the concrete 3 times, fast, frantic. Frank released him, immediately and completely. He stood. He pressed his hand to his ribs, which ached with a deep grinding persistence. He walked to where his socks were folded and sat down on a crate and pulled them on. He laced his boots. He stood back up. Russell was standing at the edge of the room holding $500 bills. His face had the expression of a man who has just witnessed something he will describe to people for the rest of his life, and who is already aware that the description will never quite be adequate. He held the money out. Frank took it, folded it once, put it in his shirt pocket. Dale was sitting against the wall, his knees up, his head tilted back, a rag pressed to his nose. He was breathing through his mouth, his chest still working hard. His eyes tracked Frank as the older man walked past. There was no anger in them anymore. There was something else, the wide, raw, unguarded expression of a young man who has just learned something true. Frank stopped. He looked at Dale for a moment. "You telegraph the body kick with your shoulder," he said. "Drops about half a second before your hips. A patient man will be inside before your shin gets there." He paused. "You've got fast hands. Don't be in such a hurry to use them." Dale said nothing. His mouth opened slightly and closed again. Frank walked out through the bar, past the tattooed bartender who watched him go without comment, out through the heavy door and into the thick, motionless heat of the parking lot. The gravel crunched under his boots. The cicadas were enormous in the dark. He got into the GMC, turned the key, waded through the long, grinding complaint of the starter, and felt the engine catch and settle into its rough, uneven idle. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, his ribs throbbing, his right hand swelling at the knuckle. He reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded the bills in the dim green light of the dashboard. $500, the cost of a well pump, the exact shape of tomorrow morning's problem, solved. He put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the empty county road. The headlights threw a pale yellow cone through the dark. Somewhere out past the fence lines, the cattle were moving in the night, restless in the heat, waiting for water that would come now. The next morning he was at the parts supply store when it opened. He paid cash. He drove home. He installed the pump himself, working slowly around the ache in his ribs, tightening the fittings with the steady, careful hands of a man who had assembled things in conditions far more difficult than this. When he turned the system on and heard the water moving through the pipes, he did not feel triumphant. He felt the specific, sufficient satisfaction of a problem resolved and a day's work ahead. He washed his hands at the outdoor spigot. He looked out at the pasture where the cattle were already moving toward the new trough. He went inside and made coffee and drank it on the porch and watched the sun come up over the ridge. It came up the same way it always did, indifferent and enormous and entirely beautiful, and Frank Calder sat in his chair and watched it the way a man watches something he has never once taken for granted. The work was waiting. It always was.